This video is going to be my version of a complete guide to buying vintage watches. So I'm sure I'm not the only one that's done this video on YouTube, and no doubt in my mind that there's other people out there that have a lot more patience to sit there and really elaborate on some of the topics. But the idea here is for this video to be a quick guide, complete but quick, key points, so that you don't necessarily have to be a complete, massive vintage guru to purchase a vintage watch. These are the most important things, in my opinion, that you should look for, and they're the things that I always look for when I'm buying a vintage watch. Now, the first thing I want to start with is, it doesn't matter what brand it is, it doesn't matter what is the budget. With any type of watch, vintage, modern, whatever, there's all sorts of budgets. The number one thing that I always am going to gravitate first to look at is the dial. I feel that the dial is the most important piece. And the reason for that is because I just feel that it's the one that always is going to be the most unique and has the most character. And when it comes to a vintage watch, I feel that that is what's really going to do most of the talking, is the dial. That being said, the dial is also the most delicate part of the watch. Hence why it's sealed behind a glass and it pretty much doesn't get any air or anything around it. The idea is that it's encapsulated in there and secure. So the dial is one of the most important things you have to look at. So first things first, how does the dial look? Does it have a look that I like? Some guys love the look of patina, others do not. You'll always hear the term tropical. Tropical refers to when a dial has changed colors and turned brown. Whether it's that brown, root beer gold, or whatever, that's what's considered tropical. Nowadays, there's people all over eBay and everything putting water damage dials and calling it tropical. Tropical is a specific scenario that happens. The paints react, different things happen, and they turn color. Everyone out there will have an opinion to make out of that. I don't make the rules, guys. Tropical is brown. Now, some guys will like this, some guys like their dials nice and clean. So you're gonna wanna go for a dial that you gravitate towards, but you're gonna wanna make sure that you like it. And then the most important thing after that is gonna be, is the dial original? Now, there's many things that can happen with these watches. A vintage watch could be anything from the 30s, even as early as the early 80s. Big gap there, a lot of different times. Now, has the watch been reloomed? A lot of the watches have loom marks everywhere for, glow in the dark, blah, blah, blah. 50 years ago, that was like the greatest invention of all time. Nowadays, we take that for granted. Almost every watch has loom. But a lot of these watches were reloomed because back then they weren't vintage yet. Somebody handed it down or had the watch for a while, decided to reloom the dial. They thought it was the right thing to do. Relooming a dial will always affect it. Has the dial been repainted? Some of the dials got ugly, they got scratched. They went tropical and people thought it was ugly, so they were refinished. All these things will also affect the price. So the dial is the number one thing I always look at because I find it to be the hardest thing to find. We'll take Rolex, for example. Rolex is that brand that you're gonna have the most access to these type of parts. So if you needed to find another dial, chances are you could possibly find a Rolex dial. But if you're trying to find a vintage dial for a Royal Oak, that's gonna be very hard. And for some of these really, really rare Daytonas, pre-Daytona, or, Pateks, it's gonna be a lot harder to find these things. So always look at the dial. That's what I always look at first. I see if it's what I like, and then I start thinking, what's the originality of this dial? And if you don't know and you can't see this by pictures, because believe me, you have to be an expert to know some of these things, ask the questions, ask the seller, and if not, seek alternate advice. Next is gonna be the hands, because to me, the dial and the hands obviously go hand in hand, no pun intended, that is cheesy. But the hands is very important. Again, a brand like Rolex, the chances of you being able to find some hands, if necessary, are a lot easier. But some of these rare watches of different brands, almost impossible. What's the conditions of the hand? Did the looms fall off? Are they bent? Are they crooked? It's okay if they have a little bit of crust or patina. Personally, I like that sometimes, but you gotta like it. That's important. But are they original? Guys, a vintage watch, yes, in a perfect world, sat in a safe, no one ever touched it, and it's a time capsule. But that time capsule has a price, and these watches all have different prices. So take everything with a grain of salt. Maybe the price is not, time capsule price, but it all looks good and it fits your budget. But I like to always look at the hands. Now, a lot of people get torn into the fact that the hands may not match the patina of the dial. That is perfectly normal. A lot of times people do get lucky and they both match, but it is not normal for them to always match. It's very common for the hands to be darker or lighter, especially on Rolex models. Think about it. When they made the dial, they didn't exactly simultaneously make the hands. So whatever was used on each for the looms and all that, paints, whatever the type of dial or hand it is, those two parts necessarily were not manufactured or made at the same exact time. Maybe even possibly years apart. So they don't age exactly the same. If you want to think about it like that, then it makes more sense. But yes, it's nice for them to match. The dial for me is always the most important. It has to match the watch. It's the correct. You don't want a red letter dial on the wrong series of sub, things like that. Or there's watches that you find that are really nice, but it has the wrong dial. And you're like, I'm never gonna be able to find that dial. So keep that in mind and or consider that in the pricing. Next, let's move on to the case. The case is number 2 in my opinion because it has the serial number. It's what matches always the dial. It puts everything together because of the serial number, the reference number. So the condition of the case is important. Now, there's all sorts of different conditions. Think of it as a classic car. You have cars that belong in Pebble Beach in concourse quality. They don't get driven. Then you have ones that you can drive, use it, enjoy them. Yeah, I have some Mariners that I barely wear. And then I have some that I'm a little bit more lenient on what I do with it, what activities I do with it, because they're not so 10 out of 10. So I can wear them a little bit more laxed. So when it comes to cases, this is kind of the way I grade them, okay? We have over polished, then we have polished, then we have restored. Then on top of that, we have unpolished. Then one click above that, you have almost new old stock. And then finally on top, which is probably the hardest thing to find, is new old stock. I feel that all of those have different prices. Over polished obviously being the worst. But if the price reflects and the watch is nice overall and you like the dial, who cares? Not everybody can afford to buy a meters first Submariner at 50K with all the bells and whistles and Tiffany stamps and all that. There's budgets for everyone in the vintage world. So just buy what you like. When someone sits there and says, oh, I want to buy this watch, but I want it unpolished and I want it with papers, I'm like, buddy, I don't think this is for you. I think once you get deep into the vintage game, you do find these opportunities, but very difficult to find vintage watches with papers. Remember back then, these watches were way cheaper. No one collects them like you do now. And they didn't really care. They throw these things away. It still happens today. Somebody out there has bought a ceramic perpetual calendar AP and threw the papers away. I guarantee you. So the case is important. So like when I start looking at the case and it looks really nice, it's okay if it's been polished, maybe correctly. You have the option always to restore a case, although that also considers some heavy cost. It's not cheap to do these things, at least to do it right. But these are the things you want to look at and grade it all together. Case back, very important. You always want to look at that too, just to make sure it's not messed up, the threads or the teeth in the back. Depending on the style of watch, some of them, you pull it out with a blade. But just look at all these things, make sure they're right, You don't have to sit there with a loop and loop everything, but see if there's any obvious things that you see that raise a red flag. Now that we got over the hands, the dial, and the case, I want to discuss the crystal. The crystal is the number one thing that I don't worry about, especially with brands that they make a lot of replacements, like Rolex. But once you get into some really niche vintage watches, it's not easy to find these crystals. But the good thing about the crystal is that personally, a lot of times you can find them. It makes such a big difference. It's not an invasive procedure to change it, and it changes every watch. So don't ever not buy a GMT, for example, because the glass is scratched. You gotta look beyond that. The crystal is easy, it's cheap, it's gonna make the biggest difference out of any modification you ever do on a vintage watch. Next, we're gonna move on to the bezels. Every single watch has a bezel. It could be gold, it could have an aluminum insert, it could have a plastic insert. It gets very complicated on the watch you're trying to look for. You're gonna wanna consider the bezel. The good thing about the bezel is that it's something that can be found. If you need to buy one, you can find one. New old stock, maybe one that's worn but looks better than yours. And this is accepted, okay? Because you get a bezel from a 6263 Daytona original and you put it on yours and it's a better condition, it does not make it a Frankenstein. You are improving the condition. It's no difference to a concourse quality car that you replace the bumper because yours had some damage years ago and you want it to be perfect. As long as it's the right part and it's not aftermarket, nothing wrong with that. The bezels usually do not bother me because you can always try to find another one. If it's all gold, you can laser it and repair it. There's always things to do on a bezel. Now I want to warn you, there's some of these old school subs, you'll have a $35,000 bezel. So it depends on the caliber of watch you are looking at. If you're trying to buy a $300,000 vintage watch, then you may want to look at that bezel very good. But if you're buying a $10,000 to $20,000 vintage watch, chances are, if you're not happy with the bezel, long term you can replace it and it won't be that expensive. All right, next let's go into the movement. Assuming that you're looking into a watch that's not a super rare grand complication, if it's a basic watch, maybe with a GMT function, maybe a chrono, something that is very popular, Daytona, Speedmaster, Sub, Nautilus, things of these natures, the chances are that the movement can be repaired. In other words, I would rather buy a watch that needs service and that the movement might need a few parts, but if the case I like and the dial has the desired look, then one that runs perfect, but the rest is shit. You understand? That the movement can be fixed. It's not a problem. A lot of times, if you have a good watchmaker, you can have this movement fixed. So the only thing that I like to do, at least with the movement, is take a peek inside, ask again the questions to the seller. A lot of them provide pictures. Make sure it's just the correct movement for that watch. Just to avoid drama and having to change it or anything. Just that it's the correct movement and that it looks good. I have opened up vintage Submariners before where they look pretty good on top. And when you open the case, the movement is rusted. Things like that. You want to avoid that because it's not the end of the world, because movements can be fixed, repaired, restored, you name it. But just do a little diligence in the movement, make sure it's the right one, and if you need to service it, that can be done. Similar to a classic car that's being restored. There's body panels and accessories and little things that you cannot find. But the engine, at least the internals, can always be rebuilt. Same thing, in my opinion, with a watch, especially vintage watches. Don't stress so much about the movement. As long as it's the right one, it's all there. The rest can be figured out. Now, the last thing we're gonna discuss is bracelet. For me, depending on the brand of the watch, the bracelet either goes from super important to not so important. On a Royal Oak, the bracelet is important because it's integrated into the watch. There's barely any loose bracelets going around, and you don't really have many options to wear, for example, a Royal Oak vintage at least, on a suede strap or something of that nature, or a NATO or anything like that. Whereas a watch like a Submariner, it's not really a big deal if the bracelet is 5-10 years off. A lot of the bracelets got cooked. People wore them wrong, they beat them to shit, and they're not well. So for me, a vintage watch like this red sub 1974, if it had a 90s bracelet, it's okay. And if you're buying it and it happens to have a perfectly mint, correct stamp on the bracelet, then it's just the icing on the cake. And the price will usually reflect. But you can always track down a bracelet, for an example, a Rolex. Other brands, way harder. Now, when you're getting to a leather strap watch, definitely don't care about that, because 99% of the times you can find a replacement, and worst case scenario, you can use an aftermarket, high-end, not some China stuff, or have one custom made. But the bracelet to me is usually not a deal breaker. The bracelet to me is usually the icing on the cake. You see a really nice vintage Daytona in gold, doesn't have the factory bracelet, there's always a chance that you can find one later down the road if the price permits. If it does have the correct one, then for me, it's just the icing on the cake. Now, the last thing I'm gonna say, it could be a little confusing if you look into it too deep, okay? But usually with these type of watches, what I do is I look at a price versus condition. I weigh it out. And then there's also a price versus originality. I'll give you an example. Go back to the Submariner or a GMT because it's an easy watch to gauge, okay? So you wanna buy a vintage watch with a vintage look. Sure, you can buy the one that's been never polished, perfect dial and patina, nicest insert in the world, original bracelet, and the price is up here. You're gonna be paying the premium for it. Throw in box and papers and I don't know, some type of war story. Price is crazy. But there's also watches that maybe have a relume dial. Everything is correct, but maybe the dial got repainted at one point and the watch still looks good and the price is a third or half the price of the other one. Nothing wrong with that. If you want to get that look and you don't want to go so crazy, there's nothing wrong with that. There's a market for everything. There's plenty of people out there that are trying to buy vintage watches that don't necessarily have to be completely the top tier, all original. What you don't want is obviously fake aftermarket stuff, especially if you're paying a premium. But there's nothing wrong. I find vintage watches to be exactly like classic cars in the sense that there's drivers, there's, you don't want a rat rod, but you understand what I'm saying. Different prices, different budgets. I have several vintage watches that I bought at first that are not necessarily like the top tier, but you gotta get in somehow. And the prices are usually very friendly to get in. It's the same thing like if you want to buy right now a 1963 Corvette Marina Blue. Listen, you can go as far as $500K if you want to buy the top concourse quality or a crazy ass resto mod from the most craziest shop in America. Or maybe you want to buy a driver. You can buy something at $50K. You understand? They're still going to give the same look overall. The only problem is when you pay $500K for a $50K driver, that's the problem. Feel free to comment below what you think, and if you like this video, like and share it. Also, subscribe to my YouTube channel.